thank you very much. The Economist wrote a tornado. This is the book, by the way. Should buy it. For the last time I say that. A tornado of evidence, a blast of good sense. So you told us why people are not so much interested in evidence. They see it, but they don't trust it. They don't trust the good statistics. They trust bad statistics because of the human nature, as you told. It's not a lack of knowledge, you said. But there's also, in the media, you mentioned, of course, there's also in the scientific community a strong movement saying it's getting worse. Inequality, as you mentioned. And the Pope started with it and said, terrible, and then Piketty came and proved it, and people said, yeah, that's exactly what we feel. So people trust in their feelings. Why is the scientific community not more open to scientific data? Is there ideology behind? Is there a hidden agenda behind? What do you think?
Yeah, that is the question. So if this is such a clear-cut case, why doesn't people get it? If you look at, I mean, I've tried to look at all kinds of indicators over this long run, and it's difficult to find anything that points in the other direction. I write about that as well. Why isn't in the scientific community among intellectuals, why isn't this more common? Well, one thing is that people are often so specialized, so heavily specialized, that they look at their tiny subject and they look at tiny exceptions within that subject. For example, when I've been talking about, and this is just a parallel, when I've been talking about, look, the developing world, and this was when this was controversial, is growing faster than ever. Poverty is being reduced faster than ever. I met so many people who had spent their whole, if not their whole career, at least their last 10 years in universities or in political action and so on, in talking about how everything was getting worse in developing countries because they looked at Africa. And yeah, sub-Saharan Africa was for a long time the exception to the rule, where it was getting better faster than ever. Well, then fast forward 10, 15 years, and then we've suddenly seen that in certain African countries, we've seen a faster growth than in Western countries, than in many other countries, because they've gotten more of rule of law and secure property rights and access to trade opportunities and so on. And then I meet people who say that it's getting worse all the time, because then they are picking the countries in Africa where this hasn't happened, or the parts of those African countries that have seen tremendous growth where we haven't seen this. And this is always the case. It's partly ideology, because very few are, for various reasons, and we can discuss this, there are few intellectuals and academics who really appreciate this kind of spontaneous improvement that takes place when billions of people just experiment. For some reason, they want the plan behind it all. And Hayek wrote about this, how intellectuals, they want the development to be intellectual as well. They want it to be some sort of whisperer in the ears of Hugo Chavez, telling him what to do that ends up in enormous development, and then they can praise it. Whereas if it just happens because someone is tinkering in his garage and coming up with a better way of producing things, it's not that exciting. But then they worry about those problems, those exceptions, those who lose out. And that is what I think we can see in the public discourse right now. There is one group that has definitely lost out in the last few years, and those are middle-aged, white, working-class people in the Rust Belt in the United States. If you look at all the other groups, all the other ethnicities and other age groups in the United States, the trends are incredibly hopeful. People were saying that the African Americans, the Hispanics, and they would end up in an underclass in the future. They are improving rapidly. We don't talk about that because that's not the problem to be solved by some sort of idea from the intellectuals. So we only talk about this segment in the American population right now.
Perhaps it's also that the interventionists need something to intervene.
Yes,
so
yes.
But as we both grew up in very specific countries, you are much younger than me, as everybody can tell. Sweden and Austria were in perfect shape when Olof Palme and Bruno Kreisky ruled, as we know. So everybody could find a job. If you left university, you could pick your employer. Nowadays, it's not the case anymore. And we go into a transformation where digits rule and people fear this new uncertainty. What do you tell people why they are better off than their parents in the 70s today, when you don't know what job we do in 10 or 15 years?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, I do meet people all the time who are saying this will be the first generation that are worse off than their parents. But the interesting thing is that I've read that before. I've read that for every generation. They've said that this generation will be the first one that will be worse off than their parents. So again, we have to go to the data. And the OECD group of industrialized countries looked at generational segments, and then they could show over the last 120 years that yes, our parents are richer than we are. But that's because they worked longer, they've lived longer, worked longer, and saved more than we did. At the same time, though, over the last 100 years, for every generation, it improved by, I think, on average of 20 economies, some 1.2% per year per age group. Now, this is not the case since 2010 and since the financial crisis. We've seen these indicators lag dramatically. But that's the case for the older ones as well. That's the case for everybody. That's what happens when you have this kind of enormous financial crisis. But if we do things right, and if we open up for new energies and new wealth creation, that will not be the case in the long term. It might be the case that in certain ways, at certain points of time, we have developed political systems that give a lot of rewards to the generation that has the most political power. For example, certain pension systems have built up in this way so that my parents got a better deal than I will get. But that's another matter, and then definitely people can say that, yeah, they might be worse off in that instance, but that's because of a certain political intervention and not because of these normal changes in the economy. I think that some of the uncertainty, some of the problems with unemployment and so on, that's part of the crisis right now. It's part of the fact that we have protected old industries and they are gone. We haven't opened up the new ones. And that is a major problem. That's a big problem for new generations. That's something that we have to fight against. But overall, if you look at where we are, if you look at the kind of jobs that we will have, yes, it's true that we don't know where we will end up in the future because the jobs that we will have, they have not been created yet. But that's a hopeful sign of a dynamic economy. I hope that that will be the case, because if we know exactly where we will end up in 20 or 30 years, then it means that we haven't really had the creative destruction in the economy that we need.
For us Austrians, it's always quite difficult to believe because we look, there was one writer who had a good quote, we look with great confidence to the past. So, are there any questions from the audience? Bitte sehr. A lot of them. 1, 2, 3. There's a microphone. Thank you.
First of all, okay, just for recording.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here. My question is very simple. I had once the opportunity to be in a think tank of the left, the Bruno Kreisky Forum. And
is that a think tank?
Not a think tank. but
no, sorry.
But I'm not, to be honest, what I am worried about is you mentioned the zero-sum game. And I think that's very popular, maybe even in the right side, I don't know exactly.
Yes.
But what can be done against this? That we all think if we all gain something, somebody has to lose.
Yeah.
This has to be somehow, yes, eradicated. It has to be killed. But how can this be done? Because you have been mentioning, or we have been dealing with education, business education.
Yeah.
And this is a hot topic in Austria because I think we are lacking this. Thank you.
Yeah, this is the question, I think, because if we could fix that, almost everything else would be solved when it comes to the political discourse, because I think so many mistakes are the result of the zero-sum myth. It's the reason why people think that redistribution is the way to create wealth rather than producing more wealth, even though we know if we could just increase growth by 2% a year, it means that we will all be twice as wealthy in some 35 years from now, which makes any kind of redistribution seem tiny to the almost being embarrassing compared to this. And if we can increase it to 3%, it would sort of happen in less than 20 years. It's the reason why people think that we have to a limited amount of work and that we can just divide it or protect the old ones. It's the reason why we fear trade, why we fear opportunities for new people, for immigrants, for foreigners, for China, for Mexico, and so on and so on. The problem is that we can't deal with it. That's the bad news, because I think this is part of human nature as well. I think this is the result of our 100,000 years of living without this kind of dramatic growth in knowledge, technology, and wealth. We have this now, a situation where we actually create more wealth, and in the market economy, we can all be better off. Both parties to an agreed deal can be better off. But that's such a new phenomena. For 100,000 years, we had around the same kind of wealth. And then if we saw someone who were dramatically better off than we were, he probably stole it from us. That's the problem. So that kind of envy was probably self-protection. It was self-defense in that era. It was probably some guy who tricked us, or a king or a robber who stole it from us. So we were always slightly hostile to them. Now, if we fast forward to today, we can see that, yeah, you can become incredibly wealthy by giving us the goods and services that we crave and making us all better off, making us all more productive. But our human nature hasn't sort of evolved during those 200 years. So I think this will always be with us, this tinge of worry when someone else succeeds and if someone else gets opportunities. The only way to deal with this is education. We have to trick our human nature. We need to explain this again and again by talking about economic theory, by talking about history to show that this is when we open up like this, we can all become wealthier. And do this again and again, because we tend to forget it, all of us, and we have to teach every new generation to do this. And it's an uphill battle. Those who say that, yeah, it would all be better if that guy didn't exist. And that's sort of the 1%, the rich, or the immigrant, or or China. And this is why Margaret Thatcher once said that, you know, if you defend the market economy, you have to wake up earlier in the morning than the others, because you have to go through this process of explaining all these, how the economy works.
Yeah. Mind the hand.
People who want to see the future in rows, they also have to have a solution for the population explosion in some areas of the world, and also for the limited resources in the world, and for the limited growth in the world. Do you have a chapter in your book about these problems?
Yeah, I do. And I think I've solved them. When it comes to the population explosion, I think fairly soon we will end up in a situation where we'll say that the population problem is that we don't have enough people. Because it all peaked in the 1960s when we saw this enormous population explosion. And a lot of people like Paul Ehrlich, who made his career by talking about there are too many people, we have to stop this somehow. The problem was that they thought that this happened because people bred like rabbits. That was not the case. The thing that has changed was that they had stopped dying like flies. And this happened in country after country. After they got more wealth, they got access to antibiotics, vaccines, better health care, and so on. It resulted in more people growing older. Not every second child died before their 5th birthday. And then when that happened, they could give new life to more people. So for a while, we saw this dramatic population explosion, and then everybody said, yeah, and if all of them also got 6 kids, we'll be out of space pretty soon. But the second thing that happened after they stopped dying like flies was that they thought that, okay, then I don't have to have 6 kids just because I want 1 or 2 to survive to an old age so that they can sustain me when I'm getting older. So what happened in the 1960s and 70s and 80s was that population growth collapsed in lots of places dramatically, from 6 kids per mother in developing countries to some 2.5 today. And this is happening rapidly. It's happening in China. Some people say it's because of the one-child policy. I don't buy that. The Chinese on Taiwan did exactly the same thing. And in Thailand, they did the same thing. And it is happening now in the Middle East, from 6 children per mother to 1.5 or something like that. The problem in many places is that it's barely we can barely sustain the populations we've got. The places where we can see this not happening to the same extent is Africa. So that's where we go. We end up in the places where we still have the problem, whereas we've solved it in so many others. I think exactly the same thing is happening there. They're now down to slightly more than 3 kids per mother. Now, that's enough to keep that population growth going for a while longer in Africa. But that is exactly the thing that happened in Asia and was used as a demographic dividend in Asia, because for a long time they then had a large population that could work. They didn't have to pay for their childcare and education or their pensions or their old age. It could result in, if they have the right policies, in a tremendous economic growth in places like that. We'll see if that happens. That's a policy choice. But I think that they are dealing with this as well. When it comes to the resource problem then, I think we are solving that because we're moving on to the resources constantly that are better, that we have in a larger supply. That's why Julian Simon, the economist, won his bet against Paul Ehrlich when it came to the price of 5 different resources. Very famous bet where where Julian Simon told him, if you really think we'll be run out of all the important resources, pick 5 resources that you think we will run out of, and then we'll see where they end up price-wise. Because if we're running out of them, they will dramatically increase in price. And I'll bet you a substantial amount that they will fall in price. And Julian Simon won, because if we have open markets, what happens is that as resources get scarcer, they increase in price. The incentive to find more of that resource, or to find some sort of alternative, or to use less of it, increases. And that's what we've seen in place after place. And you know the old saying, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. The same is the case with the oil age. I mean, it won't end because we run out of oil. It's because all these new fuels and new energy sources that are now fairly high in price, too expensive to be used everywhere. But you know, my cell phone was too expensive to be used 30 years ago. Now it's not. Technological development and market forces is driving a constant replacement of old and scarcer resources with cheaper and new ones. And I think with the right policy choices, we'll deal with those problems as well.
We had one question from the right wing now.
Thank you. I want to say thank you for your inspirational speech as well. Moving from demographics back to technology, which is linked to your answer, or the end of your answer. What do you think about AI? Stephen Hawking says that it's either the best or the worst step up in technology.
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence, yes,
yeah.
That humanity has ever seen. So I want to ask you what your thoughts on AI is. As you mentioned earlier in your speech, we can see from statistics that most jobs that will be taken up in 10 to 15 years are not even described yet. They're not made up yet. And AI is, I think, one of the substantial things that benefits this. But I wanted to ask you specifically about artificial intelligence.
Yeah. It's such a huge topic, and it's such an interesting field. So let me just offer thoughts on 3 aspects. the positive benefits of AI, the risk that it'll take all our jobs away, and last but not least, the risk that it will kill us all, which is actually one of the things that Stephen Hawking is talking about, that if we really get sort of this general intelligence in an artificial way, they will probably, what's their use for us? They might just kill us. Well, first of all, look at the benefits. I mean, I think that this is the technology that might revolutionize our economy more than anything else in the next few decades. And I probably didn't answer the question about growth. I think there are two things that are important for growth. It's policy issues, and then it's mostly opening up for new opportunities. But the things that we're opening up for is new technology that will help us to solve old problems. And I think the great thing in our world today that gives me the most hope is that we have more people than ever who have better education than ever and more access to the ideas and knowledge of more other people than ever before. And it's this combination that creates all the opportunities that we have, because that makes it possible to find new solutions and technologies. The problem is often that it's so specialized, this technology, or this knowledge. So how do we find the needles in the haystack, or how do the needles meet and sort of create something new? As the science writer Matt Ridley famously put it, progress is created when two old ideas have sex and create a new offspring that's different but retains some parts from the other ones. And then it's important that there are as many ideas as possible, and there the metaphor ends with human sex. So how do they meet, these ideas, this knowledge? I think that artificial intelligence can help us there in a dramatic way, because human beings are fairly good at being creative, but we're lousy when it comes to handling huge amounts of data. But AI is basically the other way around. And it can help us to find these patterns or these strange combinations of data that helps us to solve problems. Obviously in healthcare, few doctors can keep up with all the literature on everything that happens, so the few patients that they meet, they don't know exactly what happens, and they don't have sufficient data to go back to their whole life and compare it to everybody else. What AI can do is compare the history, all the digital footprints that we have left individually, compare it to all the literature on health issues and all the progress that has been made, and compare it to the digital footprints of everybody else, and find these strange correlations that we would never have thought of. How our environment, how our genetic predisposition, combined with the kind of thing in our food and so on, results in a specific condition. That's what AI can help us with. And without being, I think it's a conservative estimate to say that I think AI will solve all our health problems in 50 years. We won't talk about cancer and heart conditions, coronary disease, and all those
we are
things.
dead then, right?
Right, that's the problem.
So we don't talk about it.
I hope you wouldn't raise that particular point. But our kids will probably benefit from this. And if we open up for more AI faster, then that will be dealt with. And I'm sure that it will deal with our environmental problems as well, because they will find the correlation with that particular kind of bacteria that can take care of that particular kind of pollution in the sea. Eat the plastic, for example, in our world oceans. That won't be a problem. So that's the good thing. AI will solve all our problems. The bad thing is that it will potentially kill us, so we might not be there for even 50 years, and it will take our jobs. Let's start with the jobs. I don't know about 50 years or 100 years from now. No one does. We can always give hypothetical examples of AI being able to do everything that we do. In that case, yeah, it might not be any jobs for us around. I don't know if we have to care about that, because AI will take care of all our problems anyway. But in the short run, I don't think that a lack of jobs will be the problem. Because the thing that I have seen as machines, robots, and computers move in is not that we end up with not having anything to do. That might happen in certain places. But on the contrary, in most instances, I mean, the archetypical example of smart technology taking jobs is the drones. You know, the American military have all those surveillance drones, so they don't need fighter jets anymore. That takes a job from the pilot away. But you know, just one of those surveillance drones takes 163 people to operate and manage and deal and look at the data. A big drone takes 300 people to manage. When it comes to technology moving into the financial sector and healthcare and so on, the result is not that we think that we don't need people. We need a doctor with that computer, with the access to that information, talking to us about the diagnosis, how to take care of the treatment, and so on and so on. I think that computers took 50% of my job away over just the last 15 years. Because usually it took me 50% of my time to go to the library, read the microfilm of old articles to find the stupid quotes of what Paul Krugman said about technology 20 years ago. Nowadays I do it by, Google helps me doing that in 2 minutes. Unfortunately, it hasn't given me more spare time because the analysis and the formulations and the human meetings and so on takes then more time. So I think that's what technology does. It helps us to be more productive so that we can spend more of the time on doing the things where we really meet face to face with others. And that's what we need. And anytime you lose your luggage at an airport, you understand that the problem in our world is that there are too few individuals. There is no one there to pick up the phone when I call and ask about my missing luggage. And this is a true story from 2 days ago. I think that we need people for the foreseeable future. Then the question will be, how do we move people from the areas where computers can take care of it better than we? That's the challenge. How do we make our economies dynamic? And then the only response is, shortly, not by protecting the old jobs, not by subsidizing the old business models. It's by helping, stimulating, and subsidizing transition to the new. That's the thing we should be focused on. And then lastly, will AI kill us? I don't know.
But
we'll see.
As you mentioned, Paul Krugman, I think he said that the internet is going to be less important than the fax machine, as far as I can remember.
Yes, exactly. Won't have any effect on our productivity.
We have 10 minutes left.
Can I just say about AI? Sorry.
Yes.
Just one thing. A lot of people think that we will be so scared of AI that they will notice that if they have general purpose intelligence, if that will ever happen, who knows, that they think it's better to kill them before they shut us down or so. There's one interpretation among some AI scientists. If this happens, if they become so smart, they will just leave planet Earth and go somewhere else. Why would they care about Earth? They care about planet Earth because it's an interesting experiment in what happens with human beings, what we do. That's an experiment that's very difficult to replicate. So I think they would keep us alive and probably leave us alone. we'll see. Sorry. Yeah.
I just want to mention, you talked about fear, and you can't imagine why there is fear in our society. Yeah. And if you say it's coming from the news or something, my fear comes from my grandfather. You know, because my grandfather, he was a very optimistic man at the end of the 19th century. Yeah. Very, very optimistic. Yeah. This had been great times, and he thought this would be a great future, and we all know there had been 45, 50 years of disaster, really disaster, and this disaster was for us a big luck. Nobody wants to talk about this because everybody says, the Wirtschaftswunder was something from our fathers, but it was the Unglück, the unhappiness of my grandfather, the disaster of my grandfathers, of our grandfathers. And so what I want to say is, on the long run, of course, we have to be optimistic for the human race, but there will always be some kind of backlash, some kind of disaster, some kind of tsunami. Yeah? Yeah. And if you are struck in a situation like, for example, you're a Syrian technician and you can't get out of the area, you can't help him with your books. Of course, I believe in what you are doing, but fear is not always bad. We have to work with that. If you don't have fear, maybe you fall down the window because you say, nothing can happen to me. Yeah. And so I think there's also a sense of we have to have also some fears.
Yeah.
That's what I want to say, because it's so optimistic. Thank you for that.
It's too optimistic for Austrians. We are awkward. We feel awkward with it.
And that is an incredibly important point, I think. So let me just dwell on that for a few minutes, because I think that in various ways. Let's begin with the Syrian who's stuck there. Obviously, that's the worst nightmare that could befall on any of us. And the fact that the human race as a whole progresses, that's an average. Obviously, some people are suffering and dying as we speak constantly. And you know, just like when we talk about the economy, yeah, it's good if we can get down to 4% unemployment, but you know, if I am unemployed, the unemployment rate is 100% to me. And that's the important thing. And you can't comfort that person by saying, oh, look at all the others. If someone dies young, you can't comfort him by saying, ah, but look, it's 80 years on average, so be happy about that. No, we have to, if we care about individuals, human beings, and every person's eternal worth, then we have to care about that as well. But what we want to make sure is that as few as possible end up in the Syrian nightmare. And I think that what we're doing when we're talking about these liberal Western values is to try to make sure that as few as possible end up in that kind of a suffering. You could take the very long term and be a bit sort of cynical and say that, yeah, that was a bad 20th century. We had 2 world wars, we had the Great Depression, it was terrible. At the same time, life expectancy increased from 30 to 70 years. At the same time, we became richer and healthier than ever before. So we managed to get through even those disasters. But that's not the whole truth. The whole truth is all those grandfathers and grandmothers who suffered and died during that 20th century because of those disasters. So we have to keep that in mind as well. Just because I think that on the whole, things will probably go well, it doesn't matter that everything will go well for everybody. And then, obviously, we have to be a bit afraid. We have to be a bit worried about things. And I think as an historian, it's impossible not to be an optimist because you've seen the amazing things that we've done. But as an historian, it's also impossible not to be a little bit cynical because you know that those things happen again and again throughout history, where we fail and screw up miserably in a dramatic way and begin to kill one another again. So we have to worry about that. We have to be afraid of it. We have to make sure that we don't fall out the window. Not so afraid that we don't go to the window and watch the beautiful view and all the opportunities out there. We have to find the right balance. But what I am trying to do when I talk about optimism is basically saying as well that, look, this is not automatic. It's not determined. You can't take this for granted. You have to think about what creates these opportunities and those freedoms and this security, because otherwise we might end up with where our grandfathers and their fathers ended up.
This would be perfect for a final statement, but I've seen 2 hands, one in the back and one in the front row. We take the 2 questions together, if that's okay with you.
Thank you. I want to pick up one statement you said that there will be too few people to do certain things, and there's also this book by Doug Saunders, Arrival City, where he talks about how we should design our cities to be able to cope with the immigration and everything. And he also says there will be too few people that don't have this high level of education to do certain activities. So I wanted to ask what you think of this argument, because for me it sounds a bit counterintuitive, because everybody always says we need more education and there will be more qualified jobs, but is there also an opportunity for maybe less qualified jobs?
We take the question, the last question behind.
I would like to raise one more issue, and it's the environmental aspect. I mean, that's the thing which is missing from my side at the moment, because if we think about growth and all the positive future and possibilities, we have one statistic effect. We have now 600 parts per million of CO2 in the air, and nobody's really taken care of it. So what is your comment on that issue and problem?
Yeah.
Chapter 6.
Yeah, that's in chapter 6, the environment.
Thank you very much.
But the short version is that, yeah, we have to deal with that, because that could be a major problem if we don't. The good news is that we are taking care of it in a certain way. And what I do in this chapter is that I look back at the environmental problems that we solved and therefore forgot and never talk about. I mean, I wrote it for a British publisher in the beginning and at first, and so I wrote about the River Thames, which was declared biologically dead in the 1950s. Nowadays it's teeming with life. It's even got the short-nosed seahorse back in the River Thames, which is good because it's very sensitive to pollution. And the scientists who found it actually kept the discovery secret because it's so cute, the seahorse, that people steal it for their aquariums. Actually, we've dealt with industrial pollution, the 6 leading pollutants, the ones that killed us, that gave us smog in the big, rich cities, and we dealt with that. The indoor air that still kills millions of people around the world because they burn biomass indoors because they don't have electricity and gas stoves. That's been dealt with in all rich countries. Unsafe water that still takes up most of the hospital beds around the world. We dealt with that. So we did all that and we forgot it. So now everybody focuses on the next environmental problem. That's a good thing. That's what we should do. We should talk about global warming because that's where we are now. But it gives us some insight into this question about why scholars and organizations only look at the problems. Well, because we've solved the other things. No one devotes their whole, very few people devote their whole lives to talking about sort of diseases that have been eradicated. They talk about the diseases that we have to eradicate now. So what about global warming then? Well, the good thing is that even though it's more difficult to handle because it's a global problem, the good news is that the same forces are at work. More wealth gives us more opportunities to do things. More knowledge about the problem makes us more interested in doing that. Better technology gives us access to the tools to begin to deal with it. And I think that we know the fuels and the energy sources that could take care of it, that would lead to 0 carbon dioxide emissions in the future. We even have methods of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. We have technology. With trees is a technology of doing that. But we can do it with machines as well and put it in the places where in the Saharan desert, for example, where we have an oversupply of sun that could sustain, give it the energy to function. But all those things are expensive so far. It's so expensive that most people around the world don't want to use it. The question is, what do we do when things are too expensive? We do the same thing as we did with cell phones, because they were also too expensive 30 years ago. But we had more technological development so that they came down in price, and we had more purchasing power so that we began to buy them. And at some point, and I don't know when or where, those two things will meet. And suddenly it will be more expensive for all the industries around the world to use, and all the vehicles around the world, to use those technologies rather than the old ones. And then we'll begin to deal with the problems. And if we have to roll back some of the carbon dioxide, we'll put some of those machines there. Is this guaranteed to happen? Not necessarily, but I think that the trends are going in that direction. I think most of the problems right now when it comes to the environment are in countries that are so poor that they have to deal with other problems at first. I think a huge problem in the world is plastic in the oceans. But we also know that 98% of that plastic comes from 10 rivers, and they are all in the poorest countries around the world. Rich countries have dealt with it because we're so rich. So I hope that will take place more in the future, if we have enough people to deal with it. Yep.
I have to quote that on page 115, chapter The Environment. Amazingly, a modern car in motion emits less pollution than the 1970s car did in the parking lot, turned off due to gasoline vapor leakage.
Yeah, that's so shocking that even I don't believe it, even though it's in my book. But that tells you something about how far we've gone. And people do forget how polluting the old technologies were. When everybody was taking a horse carriage, You know, it's enough with a couple of them outside Hofburg to sort of notice the smell. When everybody had horses like that, that wasn't nice either. People, do we have enough people? We talk about we need more education to deal with it. I think that that's part of the story. Yes, we need more education to deal with some of these future technologies and dealing with human beings, face-to-face meetings and so on. But I do agree with you that we have a certain tendency, especially those of us with a lot of education, to think that the problem is more education for everybody else, then that will take care of it. I think that we have an enormous opportunity for more people with less skills in our labor market if we open up the kind of things like minimum wages, collective bargaining, that are only sort of designed for a very homogeneous workforce with a very high education, who already have their 5th job or something like that. There's an opportunity there. People say that, for example, artificial intelligence, it's so incredibly complicated. No one understands this. We need sort of educate ourselves for our whole life to even understand how to program this. Yeah, for the programmers, but not for those who work with it. Electricity is incredibly complicated. Few people understood how a steam engine worked. But that didn't mean that everybody who worked with electricity or a steam engine had to have this education. It was a technology that helped them to become more productive. And I think that that's, I mean, visually reading a barcode, the technology to do that is incredibly complicated. But for a cashier to use it is not that difficult. And I think the same thing goes for lots of the technologies that are being developed right now. In biotechnology, in artificial intelligence and so on, it will create ways of making all of us much more productive, even though we don't have an advanced education. So it's incredibly important to open up our labor markets for people with lower skills, because they will get higher productivity with having intelligence in their back pocket.
Thank you very much, Johan, for your very interesting thoughts and optimistic views. I think it will take a couple of days for us to deal with it. That things are really so good. Yeah, that's really something very Austrian. But I thank you for your patience, your questions, for coming, and I would like to ask you to have a bite to eat, something to drink. And stay here for a little while. You're going to be around here for another half an hour, something like that.
Yeah, I'll stay for the drinks.
Yes. Thank you very much.
That's what Swedes do.
Thank you.